Today is Irish whiskey lessons because Patty Cullen said, hey, and I'm going to read this from my note right here. I would be really interested to see you to do a comparative tasting of the different types of Irish whiskey to explore the differences in the distillation process and the effect on the end product. As always, love your video. Now, I'm not going to do a comparative tasting. Maybe that's something, I don't know, that's a whole other series where I sit down and spend the time and do like A/B comparisons of things like that. This is a one bottle, let's have a conversation. But what it did remind me is we should start by establishing the fundamentals of what is Irish whiskey. Now, a great resource for this is the Edinburgh Whiskey Academy Irish Whiskey certification that you can do online. I'm just saying. Now, there are 3 approved versions of what you call Irish whiskey, and it is Irish whiskey, E and no E, and the Gaelic writing of Irish whiskey, which is Uisce Éireann. And I'm not pronouncing the Gaelic anywhere near correct for a Gaelic speaker, but Uisce Éireann. And that's effectively the Gaelic version of Irish whiskey. So all 3 of those things are fine when you label or release or talk about Irish whiskey. But inside of the categories of Irish whiskey, you've really got 4 main categories and then a 5th that's not really a category of Irish whiskey. It's just if what you made doesn't neatly fit into one of the 4, just call it Irish whiskey. So I'm not going to talk about the 5th one. The 5th one is just like, is it Irish? Yeah. Is it whiskey? Yeah. Okay, it's Irish whiskey. Now, inside of this, remember we did the Scotch one where we had like mom, dad, and the 3 kids? There's not a real easy mnemonic type device on this one, so just think of it as this. They have pot still Irish whiskey is the truly, I'm going to start with that one because it's the truly unique to Ireland approach to whiskey. Although there are people around the world starting to do it, mostly in the US in craft. But it's really the hallmark of what made Irish whiskey Irish, and that is the use of unmalted barley. So you have, here's the 4, I'm just going to name them up front. Pot still Irish whiskey, malt Irish whiskey, which is single malt. It's what we think of the same way that Scotch thinks of malt whiskey. Grain, which is also the same way that we think of grain whiskey, which is column still, but there's grain percentages involved. And then blended Irish whiskey, which is a mix of various of those first 3. So you really got the 3 individual types, and then a category called blend, which is any mix of all of those 3 or 2 of those 3. And then Irish whiskey. So pot still is the most common one these days is 50-50. 50% unmalted barley, 50% malted barley. But historically, so there was a malt tax that the English put in, and it was effectively a tax on malted barley. Not effectively, it was a tax on malted barley. It had a huge problem for the brewers. But what it cemented for Irish whiskey makers was them beginning to use unmalted barley in their mash bills. And they were doing it prior to that, but this one's sort of like, now it's hell yeah, if we can use 30-50% unmalted barley, we pay that much less tax than if it was all malted barley. And that's sort of codified it into how the industry works. What you learn when you study the history of it is that back in the 1890s, there were mashes that fell anywhere in the mid-30s in malt, anywhere in the mid-30s in unmalted barley, somewhere in the 20 to 30% oats, and then a little bit of rye and a little bit of wheat or one or the other. I mean, that's a 4-grain recipe almost, right? So there was a lot of variation in those things when you get to the old recipes, the mixing of grains. These days, it tends to be half and half, or close to half and half, with like a small percentage of maybe some other flavoring grain. There is a requirement that it's a minimum of 30% unmalted and malted barley, but that still leaves a reasonable percentage. 5% can be other things: wheat, rye, so on, oat. That was really complicated, but pot still. All you got to remember is this. Pot still Irish whiskey, which is what I'm drinking right now, has unmalted barley. Just remember that. That's the distinguishing factor. It's still made in a pot still, which is why it gets real confusing, because single malt is also made in a pot still. So let's talk single malt. Single malt and Irish whiskey, or Irish malt, 100% malted barley. That's the difference between pot still and malt whiskey in Ireland. Not how it's made, because they're both in pot stills, but one has unmalted barley, pot still. One is 100% malted barley, malt. And that's when you get these flavors like, who's a pure 100% malt? There's a lot of craft single malts, but you'll get also Bushmills single malt and all of these. These are made much closer to what Scotland makes, or what American malt makers or malt around the world are made. And it lacks that unmalted barley classic Irish pot still note. Still great whiskey. And then you've got grain, which is effectively identical to Scotland, where it's column still whiskey. Now, grain whiskey does tend to have all kinds of varied mash bills, but like it needs to be low in barley and high in other things. And there's rules around it. But it's effectively various grains, column distillation, right? Just like Scotland. Depends on the run, various grains, column distillation. And that's your blend base, right? So when you start blending Irish whiskey, you can mix any of those three categories, and any two or all three, and you get various versions of blended Irish whiskey. And if they don't want to call it blended Irish whiskey, they'll just call it Irish whiskey as a catch-all. But often what's written on a bottle and just says Irish whiskey is a blend. Jameson is a blend. Even though it doesn't say Jameson blended Irish whiskey, it just says Jameson Irish whiskey. But it's a blend. And so that's why your parent category is a pseudo fifth. But really it's just, it tends to come down more to what you want to put on your label. So, let's drink Yellow Spot. Yeah, the spots are great. This goes back to the original history of Scotland and Ireland, merchant bottlers, which is merchants who had other business, usually a fine wine or a fine spirits retailer or ship merchants or any number of things. And they would buy up barrels and they would release them to their customers, sometimes blend them, sometimes not. And from that era, you get the Mitchell and Sons fine wines and spirits out of Dublin. And they used to actually buy up and store their own barrels, and they would paint the barrels to mark to keep things straight on what they were releasing. And that's where you get Yellow Spot, Green Spot, Blue Spot, Red Spot. This is now Midleton, because when everything consolidated down to Cork, everything ended up made by Midleton. But one of the beautiful things is that they never lost the Redbreast, which is pot still, or the Spot line. And really it was just Green Spot and Yellow Spot that really survived all the way through. And then recently they've revived Blue and Red. Yellow Spot is the aged. Green is actually my favorite of all of the spots, even though it's actually the most affordable. Yellow Spot is the first one with an age statement prior to the re-release of things, and it's a 12-year-old, and it's made up of 3 different kinds of aging processes. So it's got American used bourbon casks, it's got sherry, Spanish sherry, traditional bourbon sherry. That's not that rare. That's typical of Redbreast and Scotch. But the third one they do is Spanish Malaga casks. Now, Malaga is an area in Spain, and it's got, depending on where you're getting your wine from in Malaga, there's a bunch of different types of wine that could technically fall into the Malaga wine cask. But traditionally what people are talking about when they talk about Malaga wines is two grapes, Pedro grapes, Pedro Jimenez grapes, and Muscatel grapes. And all the products tend to be made from those two. And there's overlaps in, what is it, DO? And I'm not pronouncing it in Spanish, but basically like origin, like Champagne to France, right? And so Malaga is a regional designation. My guess is that they're using these sort of desserty Muscatel, Muscat, and Pedro dark sherry type barrels for the finishing in this, but it should add an even more dense sweetness to it. And when you pick it up on the nose, it does. So, but what I love about it is the American bourbon barrels really kickstart the vanillins behind there too. So you do get the fruit, and you do get like drizzled honey over like pear and peach and pie. But you also get the sort of like dark woody spiciness of the American oak barrels and the heavy vanillins of the American oak barrels and that clove note. And you get a little bit of the vegetal note in the nose. But mostly it's desserty and soft and sweet and vanillin and spice. And it's a great whiskey. There's a toasted coconut note in Green Spot that I just am so addicted to that every time I pick up Yellow Spot, I miss it. But the palate is very different from Green Spot. The palate is way more creamy and milk chocolate and vanilla, very vanilla, a little bit dry, and then your aftertaste is malt. Honeyed malt. And this is another reason I love Yellow Spot. The aftertaste is not cloyingly sweet and like, candy. Even though it's got sherry and Malaga wine barrels, it still stays like a nice light, doesn't coat your mouth too heavy, lets you appreciate the next sip. It's just a great damn whiskey. I think it's in like the 100 to 120 buck range, which is fair for a whiskey that's, I think, is very good. All right. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you a recommendation now that I've very confusingly described the 4 styles of Irish whiskey. But this is really fun, and this is where it gets into comparative tasting, and then we're going to be done. One of my favorite things to do in an Irish whiskey tasting, I've done it multiple times. I think the idea came to me originally through Lou Bryson's book, Tasting Whiskey, where he recommended something like this, and I went, damn, that's brilliant, and then I've done it ever since. So I'm going to credit Lou, I think, with the origin of this idea in my brain. You can do a comparative tasting of the 3 parent categories. Now, not many people release a grain whiskey, an Irish grain, really only Teeling, and is it Kilbeggan that has a grain whiskey? Anyway, there's not very many. But I would do a tasting where I did a malt, a pot still whiskey, a grain whiskey, and then we would try the blends of the various components. And it was like a 7-8 whiskey tasting. So, if you want to try a blend of malt and grain, which is much closer to what Scottish whiskey is when it's blended, grain and malt, then you've got Kilbeggan Original, Clonakilty Double Oak is a mix of malt and grain, and Teeling Small Batch is a mix of malt and grain, and the Bushmills Original, and that's what I always use, the Bushmills Original is a mix of malt and grain. If you want to mix pot still and grain, you've got really Jameson and Powers, right? So pot still and grain, Jameson Powers, malt and grain, Bushmills, Clonakilty, Kilbeggan. If you want to see all malt and pot, that one's very rare. As far as I know, the only people mixing pot still and malt is the Walsh family, and they're the ones who did Writer's Tears and The Irishman, and that's a blend of no grain whiskey in those. It's all pot still whiskey, which is great, and that's one of the reasons I love those. And then if you want all 3, then that's Tullamore Dew and Paddy Irish whiskey. That is pot still, malt, and grain. How fun is that? There's your instant Irish comparative tasting. Now, Paddy Cullen, sorry that I didn't do it here for you, but you now have your marching orders. Get at least 8 people together. Each one of them brings one example of each product, and you have yourself an 8-person, 8-bottle whiskey tasting. Good luck to you. Cheers. I'm really glad you're here. There's a handful of styles of Irish whiskey. There's only one way to like and subscribe, and click to get notified.